Hello and welcome to the World Economic Forum in Geneva and to this briefing on protecting food security during COVID-19. I think we've all heard about the health risks and the economic risks that this pandemic has caused, but one thing that hasn't been talked about enough is the risks to food security. Protect the most vulnerable people in the world and to protect their food supplies. So I'm delighted that we can be joined during this briefing by Idris Elba and Sabrina Dowry in London, by Gilbert Hungbo of IFAD in Rome, by his colleague Sarah Mbago Bunu in Nairobi, Kenya, and by my colleague Sean DeClean here in Geneva, Switzerland. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over in just 2 seconds to Idris and Sabrina. But just to say, if you have a question for our panel, can you put it in the Q&A function of Zoom? That's the little box you'll see on your Zoom screen, and we can get it to them and make sure that you get an answer to the question that you have on your mind. But now over to Sabrina and Idris.
Hi, Adrian. How are you doing? Thank you and welcome, everyone. We're really excited to have this forum to speak on this issue. And, you know, my wife and I both, come from Africa. And one of the reasons, me personally got involved with IFAD is because of Sabrina and her mother. And her mother come from Somalia, my parents from Ghana and Sierra Leone. But what the work IFAD does speaks fundamentally to who I am as a person. In other words, a self-made person, someone that decides to try and do something and get on with it. And when you think about farming, you definitely have to have that sort of mentality to be able to take what's given to us by nature and nurture that to feed. And to protect that is a really important component to our race. It's one of the earliest things we learned to do is to farm and cultivate, and we should protect that. And not only that, at this point now, when we're seeing a pandemic, where we know that 60% of employment, especially in Africa, is being cultivated by agricultural industry, that's an awful lot of people who are going to suffer and not eat because of the crisis and the ongoing effects of what will happen post this. And again, Africa is no stranger to adversity, but when you think about how long this pandemic being not just a third world problem, but a worldwide pandemic, the effects are going to be hardest hit on those in the rural state. And that's, why I'm involved. And I'm really proud to be a part of the team.
I mean, look, when you look at what's happening now with the health crisis, what we don't want to happen is for that to escalate into a poverty and food crisis. And like Idris said, my mother is a big reason for me wanting to support Africa and where my love for Africa comes from. And when we went to Africa to visit one of the projects IFAD was doing there, we really understood the importance that agriculture had in those rural areas. Yeah. Things that, my mom would talk about when I was younger about the food systems there, being someone who's from a pastoral community herself. But we are thrilled to be partnering with the WEF and IFAD to have this conversation. So I'll pass it over to Adrian.
Thanks very much to both of you. And Gilbert, I want to turn to you in Rome as the president of the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Tell us a little bit about the work that you and your agency do and your concerns over how this pandemic might hit food security.
Listen, first of all, let me appreciate Idris and Sabrina to have accepted to be our goodwill ambassador, and to hear them defending this cause is so encouraging for us. IFAD has been set up in the 70s exactly to bring investment at the local level, the poorest of the poor, and in the most remote area. That's where we operate. And with this pandemic, unfortunately, in addition, as you said it, in addition to the health dimension of it and the economic dimension of it, what we see happening, it brings a serious threat to global food and security. So what is going on, if we don't take a different path, we will be heading straight to the wall. keep in mind that we have in the whole world 500 million smallholders. Smallholder, I'm talking about 1 or 2 hectares. But those 500 million smallholders, they have to work almost every day to have the daily bread. And they feed 2 billion people. In Africa, for example, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and some part of Asia, those smallholders, they are responsible for 80% of the production. So imagine in the context of that we are living today, if they cannot sow, if they cannot plant, and if they cannot bring their produce to the local market or the regional market, that will be a disaster. That's why we are really doing everything we can to ensure that a different path is taken and to avoid what looks like a silent tsunami.
Sarah Mbago Buna, you're in Nairobi, Kenya with IFAD. We've seen the pandemic's impact on Africa just beginning to be felt. We've seen climate change making life much more difficult for farmers at the very bottom of the agricultural chain. And we've also seen in recent months locusts devastate crops across some parts of Africa. How concerned should we be about food security right now?
Thank you very much, Adrian and colleagues, for having me. Basically, this is an alarm call, a call for action, and so I really appreciate the efforts of the World Economic Forum to provide this platform for IFAD to discuss this problem. The potential devastation is huge. We are looking at whole communities, whole countries at risk of food insecurity. The combined effects of climate change, exacerbated by the Locust outbreak, exacerbated by COVID, means there's been a complete disruption in all food supply chains. And as many of you may know, the majority of smallholder farmers actually purchase 60% of what they're consuming in their household. And so when there's a disruption in supply chains from imported foods all the way into just local food corridors, most urban dwellers, those who are very vulnerable and poor, as well as rural farmers, will not be able to get the essential nutrients that they get. We're already seeing different types of coping strategies, missing and skipping meals, for instance, just to cope as prices start soaring. We're also seeing negative coping strategies where people are going into their food reserves or going into their livestock in order to meet those needs. So it's absolutely essential that in the next months, which are critical, interventions really start happening on the ground. And we have seen, fortunately, many African governments respond very quickly to the pandemic, like locking down and trying to safeguard the health of communities, which is absolutely important, and we must applaud this. But however, with that, and with the way the economy is so informal, it has a direct impact in the ability of households to purchase food and meet their daily consumption. So IFAD, amongst other actors, we always work in collaboration with other actors like the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Food Programme as well. We are mounting coordinated efforts to meet these needs. Just to give you an example, for instance, if I talk about IFAD's efforts in Tunisia, we have repurposed 2 ongoing programs for worth about 1.7 million for cash transfers, so that smallholder households, poorer households have enough cash needs to buy the food that they need. Another example is us repurposing resources up to 2 million in Rwanda to supply the much needed agricultural inputs as farming communities need to plant just after the harvest. We also see in places like Zimbabwe, which has just harvested, a big rush to go in and save that harvest, encouraging smallholder farmers to pack and store that food for later in the year. So this is a very urgent crisis that needs to really be addressed with the utmost urgency and coordinated efforts. Adrian, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Now, Sean, just turning to you here in the studio, the World Economic Forum brings together leaders from governments, it brings together business leaders. Are those leaders' minds too preoccupied right now with the pandemic and they're not giving enough attention to this crisis? What's your take on that?
So, yeah, I mean, we could live in a false reality where globally, if you just take the main staple crops, we actually have enough food. But as is being said by this panel, on the back of an economic crisis and and a jobs crisis and a health crisis, we could sleepwalk into a food crisis that could be absolutely devastating. And we're seeing at the local level that impact, as Sarah very rightly said. If you're a farmer in Kenya at the moment, you're not just being hit with the impacts of COVID, you've got a locust plague worst in 75 years, you've got a series of devastating floods that are coming through. And so averting that food crisis will be imperative. But I mean, I think what this crisis has really shown is that we urgently need to work out how we move away from the model of simply just producing more food at the cheapest cost. But actually how we do that in a way that we produce food that's healthier, that's better for the planet, but also is to the benefit of everyone. And so coming up with inclusive models that are in everyone's interests. And the food crisis has highlighted some of these local dynamic models that are really coming to the fore. There's been WhatsApp groups coming together in places like Nairobi, looking at how they can bring food together for areas that have been shut down, very dynamically. But I suppose, what we want to do and what we're excited about working with IFAD with is, right, how can we create a whole network, which we're doing at the moment, to bring a whole range of partners together to build out these smart, dynamic ideas, and to address these challenges. So the Food Action Alliance is the first time that actually a really big alliance is coming together to come up with these solutions, whether it's improving poultry farming to build resilient networks for millions of farmers in Southern Africa, but also improve health, whether that's looking at how we use e-currency and fast track that in different areas so people are not having to use cash in marketplaces, which is actually a vector for COVID, for the disease, or how we reduce the loss. I mean, there's been a huge amount of wasted food in this pandemic, because farmers haven't been able to get their food to market in local markets. So creating those dynamic networks. And so, I mean, from our side, we're very excited with the partnership we have with IFAD, as we really encourage everyone to come up with these really dynamic and smart ways and use this crisis to actually turn it into an opportunity.
Sean, thanks very much for that. We've got questions coming in on our Q&A. We've got a couple of people standing by with questions, but we've also been asking you on social media for your contributions and what you want to know from our panel. I think Sabrina and Idris, you've been collating some of those questions, and so I'm going to hand over to you to just put some of them to the folks on the panel.
Absolutely, Adrian. I'd just like to offer up, though, I think your observation that, policymakers and people in a certain amount of power are too distracted right now to be able to focus on this. And that's why this sort of paneling is great for people to just see the depth of the problem that's coming before us. We are in the now, and this is an issue that is going to be devastating in the future, and we can possibly avoid it, as Sean said, with some dynamic thinking. So listen, we've got a question here, and good afternoon, Gabert. It's good to see you. One of the questions is IFAD considering debt forgiveness and additional support for poor countries to prevent the food crisis from this pandemic? So is IFAD considering debt forgiveness and additional support for poor countries?
Thank you so much for this question. Obviously, the debt forgiveness has been a lot of discussion in the past several weeks. What we are doing, we are aligning ourselves with a colleague from the World Bank, the IMF. You know very well that the G20 has decided not debt forgiveness, but the suspension of the debt service, meaning that countries do not have to pay back what they were supposed to pay back in 2020 for the rest of the year. And the question is being asked if the international financial institution like IFAD should do the same. And what is important to know, even what has been decided by the G20, about 10 days ago, few countries, including Mali, Nepal, if I recall very well, have signed. But a lot of countries have signed with what we call the Paris Club. But a lot of countries have not even signed with the Paris Club because it's a bit tricky. We have to look at it in a very comprehensive manner. Countries, in addition to access resources from international institutions like IFAD, a lot of countries also go directly to the market, borrowing. So if they were to access this type of debt forgiveness or deferment of reimbursement, that will make that difficult for them to go to the market because the credit rating and the credit rating agency has already sent signal. So the discussion has to continue. I don't think that we have to give it up yet, but we have to be very also careful that the unintended consequence of debt forgiveness in the case of COVID does not turn to be against the medium-term interests of the same country. The position that the financial institutions have been taking is that we are ready to really discuss that and see different ways to increase the support, and that is what we are doing. In addition to repurposing our ongoing project that Sarah talked about, what we are also doing, we launch a new facility. So instead of saying that, okay, let's do debt forgiveness, we're trying to bring additional resources, which are grant resources. So those resources are not to be paid back. So we launched about 6 weeks ago the stimulus facility, and we start with our own resources and helping the countries to address their needs. That's what we will continue. In fine, what might happen if we were to go for a debt forgiveness, we will need to find a way where our member states may have to also come and help to ensure that the consequence that I referred to does not happen. Over.
Gilbert, if I may ask, is it suggested that the poorest of countries already have bad credit, and therefore it's negligible what the difference might be post forgiveness? It's just an observation. I wonder if you could answer that.
Yeah, some of the poorest countries already right now, some countries that are already extremely poor, we don't give them loans. Actually, we transform already the loan into grants, and it's really the small portion that might be loan. So some of those poorest countries, the loan that they offer to IFAD, for example, is very negligible. Yeah. But they may have been lending also from the private sector.
Yeah, I see.
Which is really the problem. A lot of countries like Central African Republic, Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, etc., they are what we call in our term kind of debt stress, and because they are debt stress, so we transform what normally should have been a loan into a grant already. So usually this is not where is the problem.
Okay, thank you.
The strategy is to bring more resources to the countries.
Yes.
Sabrina, I think you have a question for Sarah, if I'm right.
I do, Sarah. Hi, it's nice to see you. And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but we are aware that there's a second wave of desert locusts about to hit East Africa. And as an East African myself, you know, that's a terrifying fact that's going to be that needs to be addressed. And we're estimating it's going to be 20 times worse than the first initial wave. I do have a question here concerning that exactly, and they're asking, what is being done to help with the locust swarm crisis?
Sabrina, thank you for that question, and it's of course very timely. Basically, 1 million hectares of land is being targeted for rapid locust surveillance right now. And we're talking about, and you mentioned East Africa, there's basically 8 countries and approximately 150,000 households which are being targeted for support. And this, of course, requires resources. The 8 countries I'm talking about are Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Uganda, and the United Republic of Tanzania. Roughly 20.2 million people are at risk of food insecurity because of the locust movement to date. And as we know, and some of us might not know all the details about the locusts, so we're definitely not locust experts, but the swarms of locusts are devastating to all things green and all types of vegetation. And it impacts on households in 2 or 3 ways. Many of the households are both crop producers as well as animal keepers. And many agro-pastoral communities are in the Horn of Africa. And they are going to be impacted in 2 ways. Firstly, from their crops, which have been eaten and they won't be able to plant as the locusts have planted eggs. And secondly, there's no more fodder as the locusts have consumed tons and tons of vegetation. And all the rangeland, pasture land is gone, so there's hardly any animal feed. So basically, I give you this profile because, as you know very well, in those areas, the land is already degraded, and there has been, unfortunately, for the last 2 to 3 years, an ongoing drought in the area. So there hasn't been very good rains, which have basically impacted on the food reserves that are there. So we really have multiple crises on our hands. And basically, with the short rains that we've had now, the locusts can multiply 400-fold, not even a double. So I just wanted to let you have those insights about the crisis as it unfolds. So what are we doing about it? First of all, there's a 3-pronged approach. Definitely the first one is to try and address the locust outbreak. And there is very combined efforts by governments, together with the Food and Agriculture Organization, IFAD, other actors coming together to really address it. WFP also providing the necessary equipment that needs to go in, starting with the necessary environmental assessments, the surveillance to identify exactly where the locusts are, exactly where they've laid their eggs, and then aerial spraying. It's a very costly exercise, but this is being coordinated across borders and across countries, just to try and address, reduce the swarms, first destroy the eggs, and then really try to limit any other locusts that have not been as of yet identified. So that's the first series of packages to really try to address the outbreak, Sabrina. So the second one is to then really restore livelihoods and protect them. As I told you, all of these potential households impacted by that, but directly the households, agro-pastoralists, which have been exposed to the locusts, need immediate relief. And this we're trying to do in 2 or 3 ways. So providing those households with immediate agricultural inputs to start farming so that they can become productive again. And this is either through these cash transfer programs for those who have been affected, or those who are in under credit facilities, trying to ensure that they have the necessary finance to allow them to replant, so that they can basically save the next short rain season and ensure a crop towards the end of the year. On the other hand, there is livestock packages where we're trying to support them with animal feed, where the pasture lands have been degraded. And hopefully this will be bridging. It's only a bridging element to ensure that the livestock are not all lost and that they have access to water, but also feed. And this also comes in micronutrients that can boost milk production, keep that going, and also keep the livestock alive. As you know very well, in the Horn of Africa, many communities save in livestock. So this is a triple impact. When you lose stocks and savings, you can't really come back in terms of resilience. So, and then perhaps the third area that we're really working towards is preparedness. And now the locusts having had arrived, we really are looking at trying to build capacities of local government, national governments. We're working together with them and just introduce new ways of doing things, looking at drones, trying to identify where swarms are moving to, if it's cross-border, introducing new technologies, ICT, very important, I think Sean mentioned that. We're trying to deploy these new technologies to address that in the fight against the locusts. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Sarah. And I know we've got more questions from social media to come and bring in, but we've also got a couple of journalists with questions waiting to ask them. And maybe we can just bring Carol Gunsberg from Voice of America in, and Dave Mowbray, who's in Canada. Carol, do you want to go first? And then we'll try and hear from Dave as well.
Great. Thanks again. I'm here in the United States with Voice of America. And Dr. Magbago-Bunu, you have sort of addressed my question anyway about what's being done to aid local producers, whether they're using native seed or breeds, or else drought and disease-resistant varieties. Are you favoring either genetically enhanced or native seed or livestock?
That's a great question. And if we can hear from Dave as well in Canada. David.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm with Farm Radio International, and we work with rural broadcasters all across sub-Saharan Africa, helping them produce programs for farmers. And right now we're faced with a conundrum for those farmers. You've already heard about fall armyworm, desert locust, all kinds of other food security challenges. How do we balance our COVID-19 messaging, which may well conflict with a farmer's need to go to the field and do all those other things? Where do you see us balancing messaging for farmers about crops versus farmers about COVID-19?
Great questions. Maybe, Sarah, do you want to go first? And then Gilbert, maybe on messaging, just to follow up.
Okay, no, thank you, David, I think. Very good questions. I will also let Gilbert come in later into that. I think the pandemic gives us an opportunity. I think Sean mentioned that. Messaging using modern technology has to emphasize how to keep healthy and hand washing. And so that messaging is in line with really trying to save stock, in line with how you would be able to support animals in times of distress. And so we think that this is really part of the same message. Nutrition messaging can be involved in that, because nutrition is also a very important way of building resistance against the pandemic. And so as we use SMS, as we use voice, as we use different mediums to communicate the messaging around COVID and COVID prevention, I think it's also the same time to actually bring light to the need to invest in rural areas. We need to have easy access to water for households to use so that they can actually have easy access to hand washing. We also need to have access to water for efficient use and reduce dependency on rain-fed agriculture. So all of these things, I think, are tied together. I'll let the president of IFAD come in a little bit later to build on that question. And going into the first speaker, thank you very much for that. I think in light of the fact that climate change is really upon us, and it's the smallholder farmers across Africa that are really being impacted negatively about that, technologies and the appropriate and smart solutions is what we're trying to promote in the face of the locust pandemic, be it also in the face of fall armyworm. As you rightly said, most smallholder farmers have indigenous seed systems. They usually recycle these seeds. One of the big challenges that you have with the traditional stock of seeds is that over time, if not managed very well, the germinative powers are actually decline and they reduce. And then this obviously has an impact in yields. And then you get a cyclical pattern forming where you don't, in fact, get sufficient yields coming through. And this discourages the smallholder farmers because, smallholder farmers don't only grow for subsistence, they're actually growing for commercial purposes as well. And so it's very important to encourage and incentivize them, particularly in these times of the pandemic, to grow back better. And I think all coordinated efforts are trying to really promote all sorts of solutions that are going to give them disease-tolerant varieties, drought-tolerant varieties, varieties that can function better under flood-like situations. So those are the ones that we are trying to work with our colleagues in research and CGIAR to try and actually disseminate and put into the hands of smallholder farmers. And we're really looking at building on national seed systems to roll these out. Thank you for that. And over to Gilbert, perhaps.
Yeah, Gilbert.
Thank you so much. I mean, Sarah, you covered that quite very extensively. The point that I wanted to compliment, you know, David, when you think about it, first of all, in today's environment, there's no nobody has a crystal ball. We try different solutions, but there's no perfect way forward in the short term. The most important point for me is what's the lesson we learn from that and start working toward the medium long term. And all of that brings back to the front line the issue about building the resilience for the smallholders. At the outset, COVID-19 is a shock. Yeah, it's health related, but it's a shock. The Locust, this is a shock. Or the tsunami, it's a shock. So how do we develop or strengthen the smallholders' capacity to resist to those shocks? I'm more and more a believer saying that moving forward, we will really need to invest on that. And that is not just in agriculture alone. We have to think about the whole system, particularly on the rural setting and the suburban area. So what I'm saying here is a rural transformation. So while we try to focus on the production, we also have to think, how do we work with colleagues from UNICEF or others in addressing the sanitation issue, in addressing the potable water issue? How do we work to ensure that the minimum infrastructure, rural infrastructure is there? The other side, so for me, the messaging is one, and by the way, it's very, very clear that in those rural communities, we can't really enforce the social distancing as we are able to do it in Geneva, Rome, London, or New York. So we just have to accept that. That is part of the risk. However, I think what for me is even more difficult to accept is the fact that we talk about water to wash their hands just like that water is available. We forget that we have 3 billion people that do not even have access to potable water. That is unacceptable. And this is what got to change on that. So one thing is to do our best, but what I'm saying is that let's use this opportunity to start thinking, how do we, as Sarah said it, build back better. Over.
Thanks for that. I want to turn back in a second to Sabrina and Idris for some more questions from social media. But Sean, is there a role for business in addressing some of these issues around the seeds and around maybe the communications to farmers on the ground? We talked about SMS, texting, kind of ways that, say, telecoms companies can help play a part.
So, I mean, actually, together with IFAD, we've been doing some rapid sprints, you might say, in the regions, in Africa and in Asia, to look at, are there solutions coming out of the COVID crisis? I mean, interestingly enough, we're seeing like the cell phone companies realize that actually a lot of farmers were still using the old style analog cell phones, not the smart cell phones. And so actually they require them to work together and to join up. And for years, we've been trying to get them to do this. And just in 5 or 6 weeks, we've got the big cell phone companies in Africa to join up and work together to create the kind of messaging that is needed both for the health crisis, but also the food crisis, to find out where there are food shortages in the country. And so that kind of joined up approach. I think, I mean, this crisis is unprecedented. And so there is no one group that can do this on their own. I think business are going to have to work with government. We're going to need really dynamic entrepreneurs coming to the fore to come up with new solutions, with community groups, with civil society. And so actually it's going to require an unprecedented level of cooperation. And I think business has a big role to play in that as well.
Great stuff. Sabrina, really just want to throw it back to you. And as I do, just want to recognize Stephen Carroll from France 24, who is joining us with a question just following your questions from social media. I didn't recognize him out of his suit, but he's on the line, which is great. Idris and Sabrina, back over to you.
Yeah. Hey, I just wanted to add very quickly to Dave's question about messaging. You know, just because this is a real moment of evolution for us as a race, and to walk forward, you know, for those that are charged with messaging, hope, selling hope is really important, Dave, just in terms of outside of what we learn about COVID and what you are doing about the health crisis to inform farmers, is also to try and collate and package as much good news, much innovation, much movement forward so those farmers feel some hope. Because that's a really important thing. I find one of the hardest hit of this crisis are those who watch the news all day and wonder about people that are dying. And those that, you know, think about moving forward are the ones that typically have the immune system to fight it. So I'm just hoping, David, that in your messaging, if we answered that question, and I'm taking too much time, to spread some hope as well, okay?
And we do have a couple more questions, as Adrian said, from social media. One for Sarah and Gilbert. I'll ask you, Sarah, but I know it's important to remember that although we are all now at a standstill because of the pandemic, a lot of the issues that we're worried about have not stopped. And we're talking about climate issues or food insecurity issues, which we're talking about today. We're thinking an additional 130 million people could be pushed to the brink of starvation because of this. And in particular, we know how that always affects women and children. 90% of women employed in Africa work in the informal sector with no social protection. So with this question in particular, Sarah, I'll ask you, how do we talk about which groups are particularly impacted by food security during this pandemic?
Sabrina, I think that's a really, really important question, because IFAD's mandate is really to look at the most vulnerable groups. And we try to focus this, and we have different methodologies of how we're trying to identify who these people are. But they are our traditional smallholder farmers. And when we talk about smallholder farmers, even though 80% of the population, rural population, is employed in agriculture and agri-food systems as such, it's mainly the women who are on the field who do most of the production work that we've been talking about. And so it's very important for them to be able to receive these messages as well, because they are really part and parcel of, let's say, the backbone of feeding all the people that you mentioned around the world. And so they tend to be marginalized, of course. They don't have necessary access to information. Many, we're talking about cell phones. If they're lucky enough to have one, then it is definitely the old generation ones. So how do we tailor our approaches to actually reach women and also reach youth? Also the disabled, who become, you know, increasingly invisible because of some of the challenges, physical challenges they have at this point. And so we have been looking at using a medium of communication where interactive radio is very key, so that the message gets to them. We're really looking particularly at them because it carry double burdens of production of food, but also caregiving activities at home. A caregiver, they're highly exposed to the pandemic because they're the frontline people. As you know, many of our healthcare facilities are stretched, and so they're the ones who are actually, they're not being targeted by the protective gear. So basically what I'm suggesting and calling for people to do, as we rally and we try to get resources to meet and bridge the gaps that are there, we really want you to focus on the women. And we are suggesting to the panel today that women, be it in urban settings and mainly involved in informal food trade, we find that they have masks, they're able to get it simply because in an urban setting. But when it comes to transport, accessing transport, they have big challenges. Accessing finance and credit, they're big challenges because they don't have the necessary collateral. And then just having a voice and being able to go out and actually present their challenges makes it very difficult to reach them. Youth, majority are unemployed, they don't have the opportunities that others have. And so reaching those particular groups and really saying, when we have our packages, and I talked about those agricultural packages, we're actually targeting the women in those by ensuring that they're able to, in their groups, in their communities, rally around and come forward, register, and be the first to receive it. And just one last example I want to share with this panel, which I really appreciate, from Rwanda when the lockdown happened and the milk, the school feeding program was ruptured, and we had tons and tons of milk spoiled. The government has really seen it very key to come in, intervene, divert that milk to poorer households so that the school children, going children, can still access the milk even in lockdown. And so IFAD has been instrumental in trying to facilitate that recirculation of milk to vulnerable children who don't have the right nutrition and only rely on government public services to get it. So it requires us to think a bit more. It costs a bit more to reach them. And so I'm saying, please, when you support this, please understand that when we look at costs for beneficiaries, it could be a bit higher because we're going to the last mile and we're reaching many difficult to reach people. Thank you. I'll stop.
Thanks for that, Sarah. I want to bring Stephen Carroll in, if I may. Stephen, business editor at France 24. Over to you.
I'm looking kind of at the economic side of this as well, and I'm thinking about all of these government stimulus plans that we're seeing announced in so many parts of the world, and I'm wondering what sort of policies we should be looking for that would put a focus on food security while also stimulating the economy. There's a lot of talk about it, but I'm wondering what sort of policy steps we should be looking for in those packages that will hopefully address this better in the future.
Great stuff. Maybe I can bring Gilbert in here, and also, you know, two big champions for this movement, Sabrina and Idris, just your views on the kind of policies that might get people interested in helping support this really, really important work. Gilbert.
Thank you so much. That's quite a very critical point. First of all, one of the critical points is for the low-income country, the poorest country, where 60%, 70% of the economy still rely on agriculture and the informal sector. It's crucial that that development plan, their response to the SDG, the Agenda 2030, that plan is really focusing on the agriculture sector, that sector. And countries that are maybe much more advanced, where the agriculture contribution to the GDP, the contribution to the global economy is lower, it's still important to make sure that the policy also focuses on how to narrow the gap between the have and the have not. Second point. My third point is to keep in mind that when we talk about food security, it does not mean necessarily that my rural producer has to only focus only on production. It's the thinking about the global chain. Sean mentioned quickly the food waste and loss, where in the poorest country, Africa, Asia, the waste is maybe lower than in Europe and North America, but the loss, because the lack of transformation. So investing in minimum transformation will be critical. And do we have better investment in transformation? The reserve that the country have when the COVID-19 hit will have been higher and will have been very, very helpful. It's important to keep in mind that the World Bank pulled out a study a few years ago, I think, where the investment in ag sector, although it's considered as one of the riskier sector by the private sector, remained that its ability to generate employment, particularly for the youth and the women, is the best. So the conundrum here is that how do we from the multilateral or the bilateral partner with the private sector to make sure that we step up the investment in agriculture, but not only at the production level, but also at the transformation level and the access to market.
Gilbert, thanks so much. I mean, we've seen in the developed world the awful sight of food banks in some of the most affluent places on the planet. How, Sabrina and Idris, can we bring to people in developed economies who also might be suffering with their own issues the need for grappling with this big crisis of food insecurity, especially in the most vulnerable people in the world?
Well, you know, Adrian, I think that first up, I just wanted to just address the question before, which was about the policy, and I'm not sure if I'm best, you know, the best position to answer that question, but I imagine there needs to be a little bit more coalition between the farmers being supported before there is a crisis in some way. So there is a crisis map that is already put in place for farmers in cases like this. For example, having surplus food that they can't get to market, however somehow government institutions can help those farmers as a policy to at least get rid, at least be able to shift that. And also, I think it's not, again, a policy answer, but it's more about trying to find how we engage education, the youth coming up in the poorest, the rural areas, where the youth will naturally go into farming, how that educative strand can be strengthened and perhaps supported by groups like IFAD and supporting groups, because I think that's a key factor, is that, you know, today's farmer's son is tomorrow's farmer. So just perhaps figuring out how we teach that kid to best be supportive in the future. Do you want to take the second question?
Well, I mean, I think, Adrian, you know, what you said reminds me of those horrific images of the lines in affluent cities for these food banks. I mean, such tragic images. And I think what those images do is remind us of how, to the 10th, to the 50th, to the 100th degree, worse it is for people in rural areas who don't have access to food banks and depend on these informal markets to sell their crops, to feed their families. And what I hope that does do is remind people of the urgency that's needed, and to not be so short-sighted when trying to fix problems at home, to remember that we are a global community. We do all depend on each other, and to be able to look at that situation and feel a sense of relatedness.
That's a great message. And perhaps when people look at their supermarket shelves and see things missing from that global supply chain, they'll appreciate a little bit more how vulnerable their food supplies are, and how so much more vulnerable some of the people you are talking about and that Gilbert and Sarah are talking about find themselves. We have two more folks on the line just to bring in. Oh, Sarah, sorry. Just want to bring in, because we've got 12 minutes and I want to make sure we can go to all of our questioners. And we've got, I think, Natalie Mashru-Deneau on the line from RTL in South Africa, and one other questioner to bring in. Natalie, can we go to you first?
Good evening from South Africa, where we're discussing the topic of malnutrition, and there are no figures really here from the South African government provided on the effect of a lockdown, very harsh one we're going through here, onto malnutrition. I'm wondering, are there any reliable figures about lockdown-induced malnutrition on the African continent? And a little question following that up, I would really like to know how you perceive the awareness in the northern world about the nutrition and food problems that are going on in the southern world, i.e. in Africa especially.
Great questions. So maybe we can bring both Sarah and Gilbert on that first one, and Idris and Sabrina in on that second question. Sarah.
Thank you. I think I want to just say that nutrition is one of the biggest, malnutrition is one of the biggest issues that we're facing in some of the way that our food systems are not responding to the needs of a healthy diet. And we know that in the African context, most Africans are not getting sufficient, let's say, protein, micronutrients in general, as vegetables and more nutritious food is more expensive. So we are facing the triple burden of obesity in some urban areas, and then stunting, and then also just general malnutrition for those who we've been speaking about who are food insecure. So having said that, there hasn't been a concrete study yet with concrete data coming out on how has this been exacerbated in the lockdown. But I do think that with the interactive data collecting initiatives that are going on, we will soon be getting some data on what impact that has had. Malnutrition is a very complex condition, and it actually feeds into a lot of long-term impacts in cognitive skills, particularly for younger people, but it also has other additional health burdens to the health sector. And so when you have people who are malnourished or obese, then as we've seen all over the world, this impacts their ability to resist the COVID pandemic and actually raises the number of those who are impacted. And so just to really respond to that problem, I would say that governments have to take food systems holistically. They have to increase their investments in the agricultural sector, not only for production, but many African governments have not adhered yet to the 10% budget requirements that they have adhered to under the CAADP principles. So we want to call on all ministers of finance here to really start bringing in the necessary investments. And that would also automatically, if you improve on the roads, the storage systems, drag in the necessary investments in rural areas and messaging around improved diets. Now, maybe a final comment that I want to raise here is we can use the COVID pandemic as an opportunity to improve our messaging on nutritious diets. Definitely. It would not add, we would not lose anything if we could include the message around what makes a healthy plate, what do people need to really eat, which is sufficient, and how much could it cost in a rural context, how could it cost in an urban poor context. So thank you very much for that question, Natalie.
Yeah, let me come quickly on 3 points. First of all, through the nutrition question that our colleague from South Africa, Natalie, was asking. In fact, what COVID has been demonstrating is that we're still struggling with data, not only on nutrition, on different dimensions. So when you think about it, there's always a silver lining. Particularly in Africa, the gap is so huge in terms of where we stand, in terms of data, statistics, etc., and where the needs are. That if we turn it, we can turn that into an opportunity. The whole data today can become the new oil for Africa. It's really our new diamond. And something that actually, I believe, together with wealth, we really need to think deeper on this. How do we capitalize on the problem we're having now and turn it into an opportunity? The second point, no, I just cannot help it. Obviously, when we talk about the current situation, remember the question from David in Canada and the point that Sabrina just made, and to be able to have this access to the food bank, to be able to have access to the production site while respecting the COVID guideline, etc. And it leads again to the point maybe that Idris was making. In fine, not only in Africa, but particularly in Africa, we really have to rip off that bondage to the food dependency, that bondage that we have vis-a-vis the food aid, and transform the agriculture sector as a production, as a mean to have a double-digit increase in the size of our economy. The positive side of that, we know that in recent years, the price of the natural resources has gone down, including the oil price in recent weeks. That has been encouraging a lot of governments in Africa, Asia, to come back and start investing more and more in agriculture sector so that the agriculture can contribute better. Over.
Thanks, Gilbert. I just want to bring in Sabrina and Idris on the second question that Natalie had about the perception in the kind of more developed world about the issues that are being faced in places like the African continent?
Well, I mean, you know, what we have seen is that COVID doesn't discriminate, but what it does do is put people who already are suffering from inequalities, people who are in these poor rural areas, women who may be living in fragile and conflict-affected states, more at risk. So when I think we're looking at the perception, I think what we need to keep in mind, and we spoke on this a bit before, is that these issues that people in these rural areas are dealing with every day are exemplified by this crisis. And I think we've done a great job of sort of outlining how that is today. We know that malnutrition increases the chances of individuals getting ill, staying ill, and dying. I'll let Sean speak to more detail on that, but did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, Natalie, you know, at the beginning stages of this pandemic, as far as the media was concerned, you know, the optics were very close to home. Everyone was looking at themselves. And I think what's happened now is we realize that we're all connected somewhat. There is people looking further afield. I think, if I'm honest, working with IFAD over the last 3 months, being able to talk to a younger demographic, working with people like Mr. Easy, who speaks to a younger demographic, that optical range has widened. Now, people still care about their own and their country, but I think that the perception from afar, from England, from America, is that, oh, you know what? If we've got it bad, then those that were already in a bad position are going to have it worse. The awareness of that is growing. It is, and it's certainly growing at a policymakers' optics. We know that because of the outreaches we've had have been successfully received. But as far as people on the ground watching their TVs, you know, the first question is, why do we care? Why should we care? And that question spurs conversation. So for me, it's encouraging. There is awareness about this. There definitely is, especially amongst the young.
Thanks for that. I'm going to bring Sean in a moment, but first I want to go to China. We've got Sarah Sisakie on the line from New Vision Uganda. Over to you for your question.
Thank you very much. I've had such a lovely time in this discussion. I've been so excited to see Idris Elba and his wife Sabrina. Back to my question. I've been following, and my first question has been answered about the strategies that governments can take to address the situation of the corona pandemic. But right now I'm concerned about the transportation of the food. How safely do you suggest that governments can get the food across? Case example is in my country, Uganda, facing a problem of neighboring countries that truck drivers, for instance, are turning out to be positive with COVID, and my government is not in position to take them into the country because of fears of infecting people. So what strategies do you suggest, and also locally for the farmers, because they're not in position to market their products? Many are staying home. The few who are working to try to sell their food end up maybe sleeping in the market. They cannot go back home. So do you have some more strategies you can give? Thank you.
Terrific question, Sarah. Thanks for that. I'm going to go around all of our panelists because we're about 2 minutes away from the end of our hour. And I just want to bring all of them in to address your question and maybe also just to offer some closing remarks. So maybe if I turn first to Gilbert, to you on that, and maybe then Sarah and Idris and Sabrina and Sean. Gilbert.
Yeah. Quickly, first of all, to address the transportation issue, I do believe that within the economic, the EAC, the East Africa community, there are ongoing discussions to try to find a solution that is acceptable. At the end of the day, it's a matter of testing, having testing, the test kit available that you can test at the border, and then they can move on. But in terms of closing point, I would like to end with maybe something that Idris touched on, is we really need to end with the sense of hope. For me, it's urgency, health urgency, economic urgency, food crisis, but hope. And that hope will have to be in the youth and in the women, which are the brunt of the agricultural work in most of low-income countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So to invest much more and invest through the private sector to encourage the private sector development at the small SME level. We're not talking about big private sector. This is really where I see the future.
Thanks for that. And we actually had Jane Acheng, Dr. Jane Acheng, who's the Ugandan health minister, on a broadcast from here yesterday, and she was talking about the fact that Uganda have been incredibly successful in combating COVID. They haven't had a single death from COVID-related disease so far. Sorry, have you seen any solutions to this transportation issue where you are in Nairobi?
Oh, yes. Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Sarah, for the question. It's very timely. Indeed, in fact, the scare of truck drivers who are frontline really in ensuring that food corridors remain open have been affected and impacted by COVID, and this has stimulated quite a number of the governments to try and close the borders. But I think in discussion, as Joubert has mentioned, there is now new ways of introducing, with WHO support, tracking mechanisms at the border posts. So trying to track in and count and trace those who are infected, the drivers who are, so the different border posts could take in the figures and give proper support to the truckers who are there. Other interventions are to introduce bonded warehouses where truckers from one country can deposit the goods, and then the truckers within, or the truck drivers within the destination country could then move. So there's a bit of a change in logistics. Other ideas have included the introduction of health certificates. So for instance, if truck drivers leave Dar es Salaam and head to Uganda, they've already been tested at the source, and as they move to go to the destination country. So I think governments at East African communities move very quickly. I must commend the actions and the dialogue that has happened between them to keep committed to keeping the borders open, which is essential for essential goods to move, and also coming up with innovative ways to actually address this challenge. And I'm very sure that many governments, as a closing remark, really need to look at how they can regovern markets. For instance, what is an essential service? I think agro-dealers providing agri-inputs becomes essential. Looking at opening up green corridors for specific types of crops and markets. Adding up and beefing one-time investments to allow smallholder farmers to actually sell their goods to market. Spot markets have also come up, very innovative. These are all new opportunities that are coming in. Using sale platforms with ICT, so smallholder farmers can actually receive information and then be able to sell in a spot market locally. So Sarah, I think there's quite a lot of ideas here where I'm sitting in Nairobi. And I think, as Joubert has said, there's opportunities and they just need to be resourced. And I think there's a lot that could be done in the face of this pandemic. Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks, Sarah. Very quickly, Sean, really quickly, is there something that business can do to help in this transport dilemma that people face, getting these crops to, getting these food supplies out to people?
So I think I think this, keeping these green corridors open, keeping food channels open is going to be critical. I mean, for business to just actually keep business operating, as Joubert was saying, this is about hundreds of thousands of small businesses across Africa that need to be kept working. And then I think getting the right information. I think business can play a huge role with government to get the right information to make the right decisions, so that we're not making the kinds of knee-jerk reactions that will actually force us into a crisis when we didn't need to be in one. And I think my takeaway from this is the point about hope, and that there is some really, really exciting innovations that are coming out of what is potentially a really drastic crisis.
Just to close our session, we've run over time, which is my terrible timekeeping. I want to turn back to our two ambassadors for this cause, to Idris and Sabrina, and just get your closing thoughts on how we can keep this issue in people's minds at a time when maybe their attention is turned to more local or pressing concerns. How can we do that?
I mean, I think this is going to be a conversation that I will forget. When I hear people back home saying, you know, they're not so worried about dying from coronavirus, they're worried about dying from hunger. Those are the types of things that keeps this the forefront of my mind and what we can do. And I think conversations like this one will be really important to make sure that leaders continue to take action for the most vulnerable.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I think that, you know, at a government level, at donor level, at huge corporations that allocate certain funds to certain sectors should think about repositioning right now, because there may not be an economy, a people to serve, especially when it comes to Africa. Rethink the way we can action this right now. It is about looking into the future a little bit as opposed to looking right now. And it is about, you know, opening these dialogues, having some hope, looking at solutions, thinking about the youth who are very good with solutions and have innovation. And, you know, obviously the youth are tomorrow's populace. So, you know, for me, it is about investing in the future. And by the way, Sarah, your question about the transport, I really feel in times of war, you know, in times of unrest, the National Guard comes out. This is a time where the National Guard should be across any transportation in terms of the green lines. I really do think government should think about that as a, you know, that if we can transport soldiers and ammunition, we can transport food. Thank you.
That is a great closing thought that I'm sure has everyone on the panel nodding in agreement. A big thank you to Gilbert Hungbo, President of IFAD, joining us from Rome in Italy. Great big thank you to Sarah Mbago Bunu, joining us from Nairobi, Kenya, also with IFAD. To my colleague Sean DeClean here in the studio in Geneva. A huge thank you to Sabrina Dare Elba and to Idris Elba for joining us from London. And the greatest of thanks to all of you from all over the world for joining for this briefing. So thanks everyone from Geneva, and whatever your time zone, have a good rest of your Friday. Thank you.